You're scrolling through Zillow at 2 a.m. again. You've got the down payment saved. Your credit score is finally decent. You find a house you actually like in a neighborhood you can afford, and then you see it. The price went up another $40,000 since last month. You refresh the page thinking it's a glitch. It's not. Meanwhile, there's a guy 3 states over who owns 12,000 acres of farmland he's never even visited, and he bought it with a phone call while eating breakfast. So here's a question that should make you uncomfortable. Why does 1% of the population own 90% of all private land in this country, and what does that actually mean for the rest of us? My name is Todd, and I spend way too much time thinking about who actually owns the ground beneath your feet. If you're someone who feels like home ownership keeps slipping further out of reach no matter how much you save, hit subscribe and give this video a thumbs up, because what I'm about to show you is going to completely reframe how you think about real estate, wealth, and why the game feels rigged. Here's the thing. When most people hear that 1% of the population owns 90% of private land, they assume it's talking about billionaires buying up Manhattan penthouses or beach houses in Malibu. And sure, that's part of it. But that's not where the real story is. The real story is so much bigger and so much weirder than you think, and it starts with a question nobody's asking. What even counts as private land? Now look, in the United States, about 60% of all land is privately owned. The rest is owned by federal, state, or local governments. Think national parks, military bases, that kind of thing. So we're talking about roughly 1.4 billion acres of private land. That's an almost incomprehensible number, so let me put it in perspective. If you took all the private land in America and divided it equally among every single person, you'd get about 4 acres per person. 4 acres. That's bigger than 3 football fields. But you don't have 4 acres. I don't have 4 acres. So where did it go? It went to about 3.2 million people. That's roughly 1% of the U.S. population. And those 3.2 million people don't just own a little bit more than everyone else. They own about 1.26 billion acres. That's 90% of all private land. The remaining 327 million of us are fighting over the scraps. Here's what most people don't realize. This isn't just about rich people owning vacation homes. This is about farmland, timberland, ranchland, mineral rights, and increasingly, the land under the homes that regular people think they own. And the concentration is getting worse, not better. In 1978, the top 1% owned about 75% of private land. By 2021, that number had climbed to 90%. In just over 40 years, the wealthiest sliver of the population managed to consolidate an additional 15% of America's land base. That's about 210 million acres, roughly the size of Texas and Louisiana combined. Now you might be thinking, okay Todd, this sounds bad, but what does it actually mean for me? I don't need 1,000 acres. I just want to buy a house. And that's exactly the psychology that allows the system to keep working. Because here's the thing. When the ultra-wealthy control the vast majority of land, they control the supply. And when you control supply in a market where demand keeps increasing, you control the price. Let me show you how this plays out in real life. There's an investment firm. Let me not name names, but let's just say they're one of the largest private landowners in America. They own over 240,000 acres of farmland across 18 states. They didn't buy that land because they wanted to start farming. They bought it because farmland appreciates an average of 6% per year. It generates rental income from actual farmers who lease it, and it's one of the best inflation hedges in existence. Oh, and here's the kicker. If you structure it right, you can pass land down through generations with minimal estate taxes using something called a conservation easement. So not only does the land make you richer, it also helps your kids avoid taxes when you die. This is where it gets interesting. When institutional investors and ultra-high net worth individuals buy up massive tracts of land, they're not competing with you directly for your suburban 3-bedroom house, but they are removing land from the market that could have been developed into housing. They're buying up agricultural land that could have been rezoned. They're creating artificial scarcity. And artificial scarcity drives up prices across the board. There's a reason housing prices have outpaced wage growth by a factor of 3 over the last 40 years. It's not just about interest rates or construction costs or zoning laws, although those all play a role. It's about the fact that the people who own the land have zero financial incentive to increase supply. In fact, They have every incentive to restrict it. Because the fewer houses that get built, the more valuable the land they're sitting on becomes. Now look, I know what some of you are thinking. Todd, rich people have always owned land. This isn't new. Land barons have existed for thousands of years. And you're absolutely right. But here's what is new: the rate of consolidation and the tools being used to accelerate it. Let me give you a specific example. In 2008, during the financial crisis, institutional investors saw an opportunity. Housing prices had crashed. Foreclosures were everywhere. Regular people were losing their homes. And while families were getting evicted, private equity firms were buying up tens of thousands of single-family homes at auction for pennies on the dollar. One firm alone bought over 80,000 homes. They didn't buy these homes to sell them. They bought them to rent them out forever. They turned home ownership into a subscription model. And here's the psychology that makes this so insidious. When you rent, you're not building equity. You're not gaining ownership. You're paying someone else's mortgage. You're making them wealthier while you stay in place. And when enough people get locked into that cycle, the next generation grows up thinking home ownership isn't even realistic. It becomes a luxury, not a baseline. Here's a stat that should make your skin crawl. In 1960, about 12% of single-family homes in America were rentals. Today, that number is over 35%. And it's climbing. Investors now own roughly 20% of all single-family homes purchased in the last 5 years. That's millions of homes that could have gone to first-time buyers, but instead went to LLCs with names like Oakwood Property Holdings or Pinehurst Investment Group. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what about all those people who own their homes? Doesn't that count as land ownership? And technically, yes. If you own a home, you own the land it sits on, usually. But here's the thing most people don't realize. You own a tiny fraction of an acre. The median lot size for a new single-family home in America is about 0.19 acres. That's 8,200 square feet. Meanwhile, the average large-scale landowner controls parcels measured in thousands or tens of thousands of acres. So when we say 1% of the population owns 90% of private land, we're not talking about suburban homeowners. We're talking about people who own land the way you and I own stocks, as an asset class, as a vehicle for wealth accumulation, as something you barely think about because it just sits there and appreciates while you sleep. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like at scale. There's a family, one of the wealthiest in America, that owns over 275,000 acres of farmland. That's more land than the entire city of Los Angeles. They lease that land to farmers, collect rent, benefit from federal agricultural subsidies, and watch the value climb year after year. They've never plowed a field. They've never planted a seed. But they control more of America's food production capacity than tens of thousands of actual farmers combined. And here's where the math gets really dark. If you're a young farmer trying to start out, you can't compete with that. The average price of farmland in the U.S. is about $3,800 per acre. To buy even a modest 100-acre farm, you'd need $380,000 just for the land. Before equipment, before seeds, before anything. And you're bidding against people who see that land as a rounding error in their portfolio. So what happens? Small farmers get priced out. They sell to larger operations. Those operations eventually sell to investors. And the cycle continues. This is where the psychology really kicks in. Most people don't think about land ownership until they're trying to buy a house. But by that point, the game is already over. The land has already been bought, subdivided, and controlled by people who got in decades ago, or by corporations who bought in bulk during economic downturns. Now look, I'm not saying this is some grand conspiracy. I'm not saying there's a smoke-filled room where billionaires sit around plotting to monopolize land. What I'm saying is that the incentive structures in our economy naturally lead to this outcome. Land is finite. Wealth concentrates. The people who already own assets can leverage those assets to buy more assets. It's a compounding effect, and it's been happening for generations. Here's what most people don't realize. The land ownership gap is actually worse than the wealth gap. The top 1% owns about 32% of all wealth in America, which is already obscene. but they own 90% of private land. Land is the original form of wealth. It's the foundation everything else is built on, literally. And when that foundation is controlled by such a small group, it creates a permanent structural inequality that's almost impossible to escape. So what do you actually do about this? Here's the uncomfortable truth. If you're trying to buy land or a home in today's market, you're already at a massive disadvantage. But that doesn't mean you're powerless. It just means you need to be smarter about how you think about real estate and wealth. First, stop thinking about your home as your only investment. If you can buy a home, great, do it. Build equity. But recognize that home ownership alone isn't going to make you wealthy anymore, especially if you're buying at inflated prices. The people who are winning this game own land as an asset class, not just as a place to live. Second, if you can't afford to buy land outright, look into fractional ownership models, REITs that focus on land and agriculture, or even crowdfunding platforms that let you invest in farmland or timberland with smaller amounts of capital. You're not going to own 10,000 acres, but you can at least participate in the appreciation. Third, understand zoning and development in your area. The reason land becomes valuable is because of what you're allowed to do with it. If you can identify areas where zoning is likely to change, where agricultural land might get rezoned for residential development, for example, you can get ahead of the curve. This is exactly what the big players do. They buy land that's cheap today but will be worth multiples in 10 years because they understand the political and economic forces that drive land use. Fourth, vote and advocate for policies that limit institutional ownership of single-family homes. Some cities and states are already doing this. They're passing laws that restrict how many homes a single entity can own, or that give first-time buyers priority in bidding. This stuff matters. The rules of the game are written by people, and they can be rewritten. And fifth, recognize that this is a multi-generational problem. If you're in your 20s or 30s right now, you're not going to fix this on your own. But you can position yourself and your family to not get completely left behind. That means being strategic, being informed, and understanding that the people who control land today are playing a completely different game than the one you were taught to play. Here's the bottom line. 1% of the population owns 90% of private land because land is the ultimate scarce resource and our economic system rewards those who already have capital. It's not a glitch. It's a feature. The people at the top aren't breaking the rules. They're just playing them better than everyone else. And until we change the rules, this concentration is only going to get worse. So the next time you're scrolling Zillow at 2 a.m. wondering why you can't afford a house, remember this. It's not just about you. It's about a system that's been consolidating land ownership for decades, and you're trying to buy into a market where the supply is controlled by people who have no incentive to let you win. If this video made you rethink how you see land, wealth, and home ownership, do me a favor. Share it with someone who's trying to figure out how to buy their first home. And hit subscribe, because I'm going to keep breaking down the financial systems that nobody else wants to talk about. I'll see you in the next one.